In France, during the 17th century, a string of unexpected deaths led to a murder inquiry that uncovered the dark practices of a serial poisoner who had plied her trade in the streets of Paris using the popular alchemy and astrology social circles for cover. The eventual arrests shocked the nation when it was discovered that far from common rabble, the poisoners had hailed from a far more well-bred class of citizen. Unfortunately for the royal court, the case was only the start of what would turn out to be an unravelling scandal, fueled by a moral panic and the wild imaginations of those accused, that saw witchcraft, occultism, poison and assassination infest the entirety of French society, from the bottom all the way to the very top. This is Dark Histories, where the facts are worse than fiction. Hello and welcome to Dark Histories Season 8, Episode 18. I'm Ben, your host as usual. It's good to be back on the microphone. I had my summer holiday. It was really nice. I took some time off. I went camping. I hesitate to say in the wilderness. I know England's idea of wilderness is probably very different to sort of America or larger countries with more sort of countryside or rural areas. But I went out into kind of the middle of nowhere, did a bit of camping, walked around some woods, took a few books out. It was really nice. My schedule for Dark Histories is pretty much 10 days on, 4 days off. But in those 4 days off, I rarely actually get a chance to not do anything with the podcast. I'm usually always working, doing something. Those 4 days are just sort of less intensive. So it was nice to actually go away. I just went away for like 3 days. But it was nice to just go away and just do nothing. I mean, I took some books for this episode. So I did do some reading, but it was pretty hands off. So yeah, it was nice to just go and do nothing for a bit and have a bit of a summer holiday, especially as the weather is already seeming to turn away from summer. But we're not talking about that anymore anyway. Let's get on with this episode. Enough about my holidays. Let's just get on with it. This week's episode, actually quite a famous one, relatively speaking, for Dark Histories. But I hope you enjoy it. It is Sorcery, Witchcraft and Murder, the Affair of the Poisons. The largest city in Europe in the 17th century, Paris had a sprawling population of over 500,000 people. An architecturally grand city, it was the home of the newly extended and renovated Louvre, the Pont Neuf striking out across the Seine, the Paris Observatory and the Academy of Sciences, all standing on the landscape, surrounded by wide boulevards, promenades and lush green garden spaces, giving the city a grandeur all of its own. The Palais Royal and Versailles, just outside of the city, were some of the grandest examples of the Parisian philosophy that the city should be the new Rome. At its richest, the city reflected its immense cultural output as a centre for the arts, as classical French music and theatre, along with the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, founded in 1648, attracted artists, writers and philosophers from across Europe. Streetlights, powered by tallow candles, housed in black iron and glass boxes, hung from thick ropes, lighting the way for porters, pulling the carriages of those that could afford the luxury of public transport, all moving through the thronging streets on their way to a music hall, theatre or comedy club to rub shoulders with the academics, the nobles, and the otherwise socially important artisans and merchants. On the flip side, the ever-growing city saw abject poverty live within a stone's throw from this overt opulence, with the ingrained economic disparity of the population continuing to grow as the century drew on. Overcrowding was a primary factor, fueling the disease and famine that plagued the workhouses and slums. With little established support structure outside of the churches, whose reach was limited in the first place, beggars and thieves, experts in the art of the cutpurse, lined much of the city, making up almost 10% of the population. Leprosy, tuberculosis and syphilis all thrived amongst the worst off, who were rounded up and forced to work grinding wheat until they either died or escaped back onto the streets, where the cycle could start again. At the top of it all, rich and poor alike, sat King Louis XIV, who had ascended to the throne following his father's death 4 years later in 1643. Being only 5 years old at the time, his mother took the title of regent until he began his personal rule in 1661. The Regency years had been a tumultuous time in France, fraught with a series of civil wars thanks to the heavy-handed tax reforms and general economic hardships that came about as a result of their overseas wars. Seeking to challenge royal authority, the Parliament and nobles pushed hard against centralisation. But ultimately, they failed in their efforts at revolution, and after Louis XIV took over, he consolidated the royal power, pushing forwards with an absolute monarchy. His royal court, largely homing itself in the Palace of Versailles, was an extended household of up to 10,000 people. Strictly hierarchical and with a tight power structure, it was more or less a small city that surrounded the king with all the working parts needed to keep it running, from the nobles, the dukes, the marquises, the comte and the barons, to the priests and clergymen, doctors, nurses, all the way to the barbers and the cooks. Every day was governed by a rigid set of rituals and ceremonies, conducted with strict formality, and carried out by those who clamoured to gain closeness with the king and his inner circle, who sat at the centre of what was essentially a situation of control that Louis sought to maintain a constant grip upon. It was in every way absurd in its opulence, pomp and circumstance, and titanic in its self-assuredness, given the fact that many, including the king himself, believed in their own God-given right to rule. It was both at once a promised land of glutton and riches, and a cesspit of filth and authoritarian misery. It was also, unfortunately for the king, the scene of a scandal almost as grand in size that would tear through the palaces, gardens, city and nation, dragging some of the most well-to-do members straight to the gutters of the slums that they oversaw. Marie Madeleine d'Aubray was born in 1630. She was the eldest of 5 children born to Antoine Dru d'Aubray, the civil lieutenant of Paris, one of the most powerful men in the city's law courts and one of the most influential in the whole country. Living in the Rue Neuve Saint-Paul in the east of the city, it's safe to say that she had a perfectly comfortable upbringing, financially speaking at least, much more in line with the cultured revellers than the beggars from the slums. Her life was far from perfect, however, and when later details came concerning her early life, she was said to have admitted to have been sexually assaulted at the age of just 7, after which she was regularly involved with both adultery and incest. Thankfully, she managed to escape such a life, at least outwardly unscathed, and in 1651, at the age of 21, she married Antoine Gerblin. Antoine was an officer in the French army who himself stemmed from a rich industrial family who had made their fortune dealing within the textile trade, manufacturing dyes for tapestries and other fine fabrics. Nowadays, Antoine's father had left the hard life behind and was instead sitting as the president of the Chamber of Accounts in the Paris administration. It was a fairly typical union, with both maintaining the standing of their families' names and consolidating their wealth, which quickly grew when Antoine was promoted to colonel and the couple inherited a healthy windfall of 50,000 livres from an inheritance shortly after the marriage. In 1660, when Antoine's fiefdom was elevated to a marquisate, they entered the lower ranks of nobility by obtaining the titles of the Marquis de Brinvilliers. Unfortunately, life was not all roses, despite these successful outward appearances. In the first place, Antoine was not a particularly attentive husband, and both he and Marie had begun to have affairs. Making matters worse for the marriage was Antoine's fairly dreadful ability to manage the household's finances, and before long, Marie was forced to set up a separation of goods to shut him off from her own money, simply to prevent him from squandering their entire fortune. As was seemingly fairly common in Paris at the time, affairs were not necessarily kept in secret, and it wasn't long before Marie's family found out about her extramarital relations, the news of which left them most unhappy, which was more of a reaction than her husband, Antoine, who didn't seem to be overly bothered by it, perhaps because he was off with his own mistress anyway. The man that Marie had become so enamoured with was typically one of Antoine's colleagues and friends who he had met whilst in active service within the military. He was the cavalry captain Gaudin de Sainte-Croix. Marie's father grew so upset by the situation, and perhaps realising that his daughter seemed not to respond to their disapproval, that he decided to have Sainte-Croix arrested, which happened fairly unceremoniously on the night of the 19th of March, 1663, whilst he was riding alongside Marie in one of her coaches. He was dragged off to the Bastille, a domineering moated fortress in the east of the city, where he was locked up for 6 weeks, before being kicked back out into the street on the 2nd of May. This entire event infuriated Marie, who saw her father's actions as an inexcusable affront. Unsurprisingly, as soon as he was released, the two restored their relations and continued on with their affair, while Sainte-Croix got back to his normal life of gallivanting around Paris. Following his short incarceration, Sainte-Croix had moved house, and now, in his new home, he built a fully equipped laboratory, mostly with Marie's money, which he was also using to gamble late into the night. Sainte-Croix was a handsome man and charismatic to boot, and whilst he used these traits to sell Marie a fantasy of luxury and wealth, he simultaneously siphoned her own money away in order to live a life of extravagance. By 1666, Marie was beginning to feel the pinch of funding a rather expensive lover, and so, together with Sainte-Croix, the two came up with a plan to murder her father in order to get their hands on his more than healthy inheritance. It was a rather complicated affair, and it started with the hiring of a new servant for her family's household, who could act under the orders of Marie, essentially as an undercover assassin. The man who they hired was named Gascon, and they found a position for him as a general servant. All the whilst he was working, the slow process of gradually poisoning her father began. Several months later, whilst on vacation at her father's estate, Marie decided to speed things along by poisoning him over 30 times, accelerating his slow decline to a full-on downward spiral into a painful vomiting fit that he described as a strange burning of the entrails. By the time they returned to Paris on the 10th of September, he was gravely ill and passed away soon after. The doctors, of course, found nothing suspicious. He'd been ill for some time after all, and they attributed his death to a recurring attack of gout. The inheritance afforded Marie and Sainte-Croix a good life for a short while, but before long they were back to square one and finding themselves in need once more. Once again, they decided that the best thing to do in such a situation was to turn to murder, and they subsequently murdered two of Marie's brothers, once again installing a servant, this time named Hamelin, into each of their houses and slowly poisoning them. Her elder brother, who they had decided to murder first, almost discovered the plot on one occasion when he found his drink tasted bitter and metallic, but the quick-thinking Hamelin suggested that someone must have previously used the cup for medicine and removed it from the table for cleaning. Proceeding with a little more caution, the poisoning soon resumed, leading to his death in June of 1670, following a long period of vomiting and weight loss. With one down, Hamelin turned his focus upon the younger brother, poisoning his food and wine, and then caring for him as he quickly deteriorated in order to cover for his murderous task. The second brother died in September, 3 months after the first. Only this time, things were not so simple. It did not go amiss that the two brothers had died of near-identical symptoms so close to one another. An autopsy was carried out, but with the science of poisons in such a primitive state, the doctor was unable to confirm the presence of any malicious chemical, though we could at least see that the state of the internal organs were not at all usual to a natural death. With no suspects, however, and no proof of poison, the suspicions never amounted to anything more, and the avenue of inquiry was soon dropped. Unfortunately for Marie and Sainte-Croix, neither brother had left much in the way of their substantial wealth to her in their wills, and so their murders had all been for very little. In fact, Hamelin managed to come off better after the younger brother had written him into his will, leaving him a small sum of money in thanks for caring for him whilst he was on his deathbed. Once again, Marie and Sainte-Croix were back where they had started, and so, of course, they just continued doing what they were now seemingly getting rather good at, this time targeting Marie's sister for a slow and painful death. Her sister-in-law, too, had inherited a rather large sum when her father had passed away, and so she too found herself in the pair's sights, when, luckily for both, things flipped entirely on their heads with the unexpected death of Sainte-Croix in July of 1672. Apparently, the death had been less of a surprise for him than it had been for others, as he had seemingly been suffering in silence for some time, unbeknown to Marie. Even more, unfortunately for Marie, Sainte-Croix had died deeply in debt, and when the creditors came calling, they sealed off his house in order to assess the contents' value so that they could recoup some of their losses. This was not a good situation for Marie, given the sheer amount of damning evidence that existed within his laboratory, not least of which included a scroll signed by Sainte-Croix insisting that a locked trunk be handed to Marie upon his death. Not so keen to hand it straight over, the creditors opened it up and looked inside, finding a collection of glass vials full of an unknown liquid. Handing these over to the authorities, it was inspected and found to contain a complicated mix of poisons, including antimony, vitriol, and opium, along with a promissory note for 30,000 livres that dated back to the time of her father's death. Although the poisons could not all be identified, their use was quickly understood when they were tested on a pigeon and a dog, killing them both outright. Things then accelerated rather quickly for Marie, who decided it best to flee the country to England, following a formal complaint being raised against her. Meanwhile, Hamelin was arrested on the streets of Paris, where, rather damningly, he was found to be carrying a vial of Cypriot vitriol. During his trial, he testified that he had been using this vial to treat shaving cuts in his profession as a barber, though it did little to save him from his fate, and he was sentenced to torture and execution. In the 17th century, torture was a common exercise carried out on a criminal before their execution in the hopes that, hopeless and not wanting to carry lies to their death, and of course the sheer suffering, would lead them to spill all of their secrets, including any accomplices of further crimes. On this occasion, Hamelin was subjected to an instrument that was named the brodequins. Seated on a wooden bench, his legs were tied to 3 sheets of wood, one on either side of the shin and another between the 2 legs. Wedges were then hammered into the gaps, slowly crushing the legs between the planks. Hamelin remained quiet throughout, but when the relief of his release from the instrument overwhelmed him, he broke down, confessing to murdering the 2 brothers. Unfortunately, the pain was only just beginning for Hamelin, who was then placed on the wheel, where he was struck with iron bars repeatedly, breaking his bones before being left to die slowly. All the while Hamelin had been at trial, Marie had been living in England, where she hoped she would be out of the reach of the French justice system. Unfortunately for her, she was wrong, and her extradition was granted, though the English officials had managed to drag their feet over the paperwork just long enough to allow her to escape back to the continent, where she lived a relatively nomadic life, hopping around from one place to another. In 1676, she rented a room in a convent in Liège, which would prove to be her error. When officials became aware of her presence in the city, the French applied for her arrest, which was promptly granted and carried out on the 25th of March. In her room, they found a full written confession, wherein Marie admitted to killing her father and 2 brothers, along with fresh admissions that she had at one point attempted to poison both her husband and her daughter. She also wrote that 3 of her 5 children had been illegitimate, 2 from St. Croix and 1 from one of her cousins, and further that she had induced abortion on many, many occasions. Once, following a fairly unholy relationship with her brother, this was apparently not unusual, and she admitted to having committed incest on more than 300 occasions. Naturally, these revelations sparked intense interest from the public, who, far from seeing her upbringing as a traumatic series of abuses, simply dubbed her as evil incarnate. Following a military escort back to Paris, Marie was incarcerated and subjected to intense interrogations, wherein she refused to admit her guilt, chalking her written admission as nothing more than the delirious ramblings that she had scribbled down while suffering a fever. The note was admitted as evidence anyway, and then, in July, a breakthrough was uncovered when a barrister named Jean-Baptiste Briancourt, who had been employed by Marie to tutor her children in the past, came forward to testify against her. He told officials that, shortly after his employment by Marie, the 2 had become lovers, and then, during a vacation, Marie had actually told him all about her plot to kill her brothers, and had hinted fairly openly at having killed her father too. She also told him that she'd be interested in having him help her to kill her sister and her sister-in-law. Alarmed at this revelation, Briancourt had turned down the offer to get involved in her murderous tendencies, which he said only sought to anger her. Following this, their relationship, as you can imagine, quickly deteriorated, and then, after St. Croix had attempted to murder him, he took his leave of the household for good. Marie rejected the testimony completely, but it did her no good, and the courts found her guilty and sentenced her to torture and execution. Rather than the brodequins, Marie was subjected to a form of water torture, whereby she was stripped naked, her wrists shackled to the wall, whilst her ankles were shackled to the floor. She was then bent backwards over a table and forced to drink 3 large buckets of water, which were poured into her mouth via a hollowed-out cow's horn. The whole experience proved to be rather unsatisfying for the officials, who gathered no new information from the process. Marie was then carted through the streets of Paris to the Place de Grève, where her head was shaved and then chopped off by an executioner with a large sword. Her lifeless body was then tossed onto a fire, with her ashes casting off into the wind. The Brinvilliers poisoning case had caused quite an uproar in the streets of Paris. Not only was it a scandal full of debauchery, but it had involved a member of the minor nobility. Furthermore, the overwhelming public opinion was that the case had not been an isolated incident, rather just one in a poisoning ring that had ripped through France. At the time, poisoning in France was seen as something that foreigners did, and far more common in Italian cities rather than French. A new wave of paranoia and fear gripped the nation, which had recently been living through an era of great confidence in its superiority. And the fact that Marie was a marquise only meant that no one could be above suspicion. And it wasn't just the public that was concerned either. Naturally, with the lurid details and the presence of nobility involved, the case had piqued the interest of the king, who had followed the arrest and trial of Marie closely. He too felt that this was likely not an isolated case, and being at the centre of the royal court, he was well aware that he had made as many enemies as he had friends. If poison was part of the nobility, he had every right to be interested in exposing it, for his own sake as much as his reigns and his country. By the 1660s, King Louis XIV had officially taken power and begun his rule of France, for which he intended to bring glory through both a strong economy and a strong military. To this end, he had appointed a new war minister, François-Michel Le Tellier, the Marquis de Louvois, better known simply as Louvois, and the finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who replaced the previous minister after Louis had him arrested for embezzling huge wealth. The arrest was, however, just as much about consolidating power than it was financial crimes. After perusing the old minister's home, he was so impressed by its grandeur that he employed the architect to work on the new palace at Versailles. Whilst Colbert worked to strengthen French exports, Louvois worked to strengthen the army, growing it to become the largest in all of Europe. For Louis's part, he worked to strengthen his rule by consolidating power and locking the nobility within his grasp. To this end, he created the court of Versailles, from the design of the building to the court rituals which he used to maintain control and erode the influence of others. Making himself readily available and a man of routine, members of the court fought amongst themselves to gain his favour and attention, following him around the palace from the moment that he sat up in bed in the morning, where the closest were fortunate enough to dress him, to the moment he went to sleep at night. One of the most important ways to be noticed at court was to be presented in proper attire, a style of French-made clothing that was intensely expensive, and intentionally so. The court was encouraged to look down upon any that were not dressed up to snuff, and in this way, Louis kept the power struggles amongst the lesser nobility, whose finances were never allowed to get out of hand, as it cost so much simply to attend court, and this was before they partook in the gambling which saturated daily life, and more often than not, indebted them rather than enriched them. In this way, the nobility remained stripped of power and unable to build power back in their own home boroughs, nor in the court itself. Due to the hierarchy, some of the most powerful and therefore most dangerous to Louis were the women of the court, who were seen as inferior to men in the official hierarchy. However, some had the potential to hold huge amounts of power and influence. In particular, his long string of mistresses, often themselves married women, with whom he spent a great deal of time and had a series of illegitimate children with. They were some of the most powerful people in the court. Louise de Vallière was the king's first official mistress, a 17-year-old that carried 4 of his children, and whose relationship with the king crossed over with François Athénée de Rochecart, the Marquise de Montespan, a married woman who carried 7 more of the king's children. The king's relationship with Montespan had flourished whilst her husband had been exiled to rural France by the king himself. This jumping from mistress to mistress was a common theme for Louis, who usually paid them off once he had grown tired of them, and built them grand properties in return for their services rendered. Throughout his life at the centre of the court, it's clear that an important mantra for Louis was the concept of keeping your friends close, but your enemies closer. As such, when the fear of poison and murder began to spread through France, especially when it was found to have infiltrated the nobility, it became painfully clear to see just why Louis found it as shocking as the rest of the general public. The court and his life was full of men and women who could see him as a target. In 1677, less than a year after the Brinvilliers case had concluded, his fears came home to roost when an arrest was carried out which hinted at a poison plot much, much closer to home and unravelled to an unbelievable story of dark scandal and debauchery that even the king could not commend. Magdalene de Lagrange was a 36-year-old widow living in Paris in 1677 who made her living as a fortune-teller following the execution of her husband, who'd worked as a tax collector and been caught handling stolen goods. Her day-to-day work mainly revolved around a basic bit of astrology and palmistry with some folk and beauty remedies mixed in on the side. Her claim to fame was her alleged ability to predict the Queen's pregnancies, as well as the outcomes of the French battles with the Dutch in the ongoing war. She did have one fairly unique grift in her arsenal, whereby she would tell her sickly clients who were visiting that she could tell that they'd been poisoned. Luckily for them, she had just the antidote, which she would then sell them for a keen price. Magdalene made her home in the house of her landlord, an elderly lawyer named Jean Faury, who she eventually married on 17th of August 1676. At least, so the officials thought. In truth, the marriage was another one of Magdalene's grifts. She had forged the marriage certificate and then, alongside a priest named Abbot Nail, who was posing as Faury, visited the notary in order to write up a marriage certificate that would see him leaving the entirety of his estate to Magdalene in the event of his death. Shortly after, Faury did happen to die, and when his family found out that they were no longer to benefit from his will, they took the matter to the criminal lieutenant of Paris, who opened up an official investigation. The forged certificates were quickly uncovered, and Magdalene and Nail tracked down and arrested on suspicion of murder by poison. For a while, it was a fairly unassuming affair, a cut-and-shut case of forgery and murder. But then, after she'd been incarcerated for some time, Magdalene wrote to Louvois with a claim that she had picked up important information whilst in prison that she was quite sure he would want to know. She had heard whisperings, she told him after he had summoned her to his home in Paris, that there was a clandestine espionage plot with designs on poisoning the king. Although she was unable to show any evidence of how she had come across this information, and there was a very real chance that she was simply trying to make herself valuable in order to seek a pardon or simply to delay her own trial, Louvois had to take the warning seriously, and he notified the king immediately. Meanwhile, Magdalene was transferred to the Bastille for further questioning, the responsibility of which had been handed over to Nicolas Gabriel de la Reynie, the chief of the Paris police. The interrogations continued in June before La Reynie lost his patience with the lack of new or substantial information and booted her back to her grubby cell in prison to await trial. In October, however, new developments gave La Reynie a pause for concern. An anonymous letter had been stumbled upon, apparently dropped and forgotten in a Paris church, that suggested someone, somewhere, had knowledge of a plot to assassinate the king via a poisoned napkin. Madeleine was questioned about the letter again and again, but she seemed to have no idea about its existence, and so, finally figuring that her usefulness had run dry, La Reynie stood her aside for her trial, which finished with a sentence of torture and execution for both Madeleine and Nail, both of which lodged appeals. Meanwhile, La Reynie was busy making arrests. Louis Vernet was a 30-year-old gentleman who had dabbled in homemade remedies and fraud, who claimed he had the knowledge to formulate gold. Whilst many doubted these claims, it was undeniable that he had been seen in possession of bills of exchange worth stupendous sums of money. Vernet's alchemical formula for gold turned out to involve vast quantities of herbs, which were apparently being distilled down in his home laboratory. Now, this would have been suspicious enough on its own, but when peripheral arrests were made, testimonies began flowing in that Vernet had been seen selling mysterious liquids, supposedly exported for sale abroad. Even more damning were the accusations that said that he had several high-ranking clients, and that he had poisoned several eminent persons around Paris, and that he was prone to murdering anyone in his inner circle that he believed stepped out of line. When they looked into these claims, it was found that 5 members of his household had recently died, all of which had been unexpected or unexplained. A string of further arrests were made as more and more of Venet's associates were found to have recently lost family members in unexpected circumstances. It was all looking quite bleak for Venet and his assistant, who had been arrested in the same raid. Realising his position, his assistant attempted to barter for a pardon by telling Le Rene that he had important information which concerned the king. Meanwhile, arrests continued to be made, and in December, 2 more fortune-tellers, Marie Vigoureux and Marie Bosset, who were both picked up following a tip-off from a lawyer. The tip-off went that Vigoureux had thrown a tea party for a selection of her clients, of which the lawyer had attended. Over drinks, when lips had loosened somewhat, the lawyer told police that he had overheard a conversation where Marie Bosset claimed to have made a fortune poisoning well-to-do people and boasted that she needed only 3 more victims until she could retire as a wealthy woman. The arrests now put scrutiny on all of the fortune-tellers across Paris, of which there were literally hundreds. Telling futures, reading palms and writing up horoscopes, doling out medicine and folk remedies and concocting beauty remedies, these fortune-tellers were generally seen as harmless fun, though the information many of them held on their clients had all the potential to be very dangerous indeed. Alongside the more run-of-the-mill fortune-tellers, there were some who professed to be able to divine the location of long-lost treasure or to create love remedies that amounted to little more than what many would classify as magic spells that crept alarmingly close to witchcraft. For those seeking escape from an unwanted marriage, there was of course the flip side, and spells could be sought that could put an end to a union, and in the most extreme examples, animals' hearts and human bones would be used in ceremonies to bring about a swift death to the intended target. Unsurprisingly, this somewhat more occult side of the fortune-teller's trade had been made illegal for some time, but the law was rarely upheld, and the practice had become something of an open secret within the streets of Paris. Following the arrests, Le Rene now found himself convinced that Paris had become the home of a vast underground network of poisoners. He also began to believe that Madeleine de Lagrange held the information that would help him to uproot it. Unfortunately for him, Madeleine was still proving an unhelpful prisoner, and by February of 1679, her appeal was rejected and her execution loomed. Under torture, she remained quiet, and right up to her death, when she was hanged and then tossed on a fire, she gave no fresh information to the officials. Instead, Le Rene turned his attention to Vigoureux and Bosset and spent a fair amount of time rounding up their clients and associates, hoping to secure information from at least one of them. This was a move that paid off after the arrest of Marguerite de Puylaillon, who had been a client of both women. Puylaillon had been having a long-running affair which she had funded with the money that she had been stealing from her husband, and she had visited Vigoureux in the hopes of securing a solution that might aid her in this deception. Vigoureux had sent her to Bosset, who had mixed up a concoction of soap and arsenic, which she used to wash one of Puylaillon's husband's shirts, which Bosset promised her would make him sick enough to allow her to rob his strongbox whilst he was bedridden with illness. This was a dubious plan that was allegedly never realised, after the poisonous soap stained the shirt so badly that Puylaillon had been unable to put it to test. Instead, Puylaillon went for a more direct route, handing over small phials of poison to her servant and instructing them to put it in her husband's food. Fortunately for her husband, the servant refused to murder their master and poured them away instead, and when he caught wind of his wife's poisoning plot, he opted to have her sent to a convent. Not one to be called a quitter, however, Puylaillon left the convent later that year and paid a visit to both Vigoureux and Bosset, where the trio plotted to kill her husband. This time, they planned to poison a toad with arsenic, and then, collecting this poisoned frog's urine, they would use this supposedly toxic fluid to coat his cup, poisoning him in the process. This was another fairly dubious plan, and once more, it was never realised, as Vigoureux and Bosset and Puylaillon were all arrested before they could make any attempt. By now, the amount of arrests being made were causing a fresh panic in the streets of Paris. It seemed that every class was involved, and everyone could be a potential poisoner. Everywhere people spoke about it, they flicked back in their minds through the death of their family members and friends, wondering if they might have been the victim of an undercover poisoner. Le Reni was also acutely aware that his arrests were growing and that his inquiry was turning into a serious issue. He informed the king of his progress, who, in consultation with Louvois, gave orders to form a special commission that would hear all cases related to the arrests, allowing for both a speedy turnover and the ability to keep the details out of the public eye. The commission would go on to be known as the Chambre Ardente and would become one of Europe's largest ever criminal trials. It would also prove to be one of the darkest. In the weeks before and after the formation of the Chambre Ardente, Le Reni continued making arrests, questioning suspects and their affiliations, and slowly he began to notice a trend. Over and over again, he was hearing the same name, La Voisin. Catherine Montvoisin, or La Voisin as most knew her, was a 42-year-old fortune teller who was alleged to have been carrying out a side business as a backstreet abortionist. She had been practicing astrology since she was 9 years old and saw her talents in the field as a gift from God. She had been praying one day, she said, when God had apparently spoken to her and told her to use this gift, which she believed she was doing, all for his glory. This way of honouring God had, over the years, furnished her with a great deal of wealth, and she had been living in a relative luxury in a small suburb on the outskirts of central Paris, where she saw clients working through her busy appointment book during the day and then kicking back at night, partying during the evening. She was married to a silk trader, but his business had long since been liquidated following bankruptcy, and now he was living off her substantial income. There were rumours floating around the couple that their married life was far from happy, and even that Voisin would have liked to have killed her husband, were it not for the fact that he was good friends with the city executioner who had assured him he would enforce an autopsy should he ever die. During questioning, Voisin denied all wrongdoing, instead pushing suspicion back onto the previously arrested Bosset, who she said she had frequently sent clients to. Bosset retaliated by accusing Voisin of selling powders made of crushed diamonds that were intended to tear apart a victim's innards, and of taking large sums of money from a high-ranking lady whose husband she had promised to murder. She also confirmed the rumours that her marriage was a rocky affair, saying that Voisin had attempted to kill her husband on numerous occasions, aided by the spells of a magician that was known as Le Sage. Apparently, Le Sage had buried a sheep's heart in her garden in some kind of ritual to speed the process along. This wasn't the only thing buried in her garden too, by all accounts. Several people accused Voisin of having the remains of hundreds, if not thousands, of aborted fetuses buried under her lawn. When all of these accusations were put to her, she waved them away, somewhat concerningly, refusing to deny them. With these accusations flying freely, it was then Voisin's turn to shake the inquiry, when she began dropping names of several high-ranking clients, including one who had paid her a lot of money for a vial of poison and for a poisoned bouquet of flowers that she had intended to send to another woman that had given her cause for jealousy. These accusations would have been concerning no matter who they'd been levied against, but Voisin was up in the stakes by pointing the finger at a woman named Françoise Dedreau, who just so happened to be related to several members of the Chambre Ardente's judiciary, as well as members of the royal court. Perhaps even more concerning was that she wasn't the only one, and as the days passed, Le Reni saw more and more high-ranking members of Paris society accused, arrested and questioned. On the 4th of May, Figaro and Bosset were sent to trial, and when they were inevitably both found guilty and sentenced to torture and execution, fresh names and stories were uncovered. Bosset, whilst under severe torture, gave up a story that the Maréchal Duc de Luxembourg, one of France's foremost generals, had visited her to inquire about her ability to summon the devil. Shortly after she had given up this information during torture, she was tossed on a fire and burnt alive, along with her son who had assisted her in the preparation of her poisons. Figaro never even made it that far, dying while she was being tortured. A month later, Marguerite de Puylaurens was sent to trial, where she too was found guilty. Under torture, she admitted to wanting to hurt and rob her husband, but denied attempting to murder him. Her trial had been a big deal given her high position, and it angered Le Reni when her sentence of beheading was downgraded to banishment. It was some consolation for him that her banishment never came to fruition, and instead she spent the rest of her life in prison. But it still seemed to him that the Chambre Ardente was favouring those of the highest rank. By September, Voisin was beginning to talk openly about her well-to-do clientele. In what was her fullest testimony to date, she described purchasing poison from Magdalene de Lagrange to sell to a client who had requested it to kill her husband. Bringing the focus back onto Drew, she said she had desperately wanted to kill her husband, but feared being caught if she used poison, so instead she wanted to achieve it through occult means. The plan had fallen through after she had been unable to steal one of her husband's shirts. Voisin then tossed a new name into the ring, this time fingering the Duchess de Vivonne, who had visited her hoping to buy poison to kill her husband after her visits to the magician Lesage had failed to bear any fruit. The shocking thing with this name was that Vivonne was the sister-in-law of the Marquise de Montespan, mistress to Louis, the King of France. Fortunately for Lerigny, he did not have to go far to question Lesage in order to verify Voisin's claims. Lesage had already been arrested in connection with several other suspects, but until now he'd only been seen as a peripheral figure. Thanks to Voisin, he had now rocketed up the list, all the way to the top. Adam Lesage was a 50-year-old man who hailed from Normandy, where he officially worked as a textile merchant. Now in Paris, he had the somewhat more unusual occupation of magician. His speciality was to have his clientele write their wishes on a sheet of paper, which he would then encase inside a ball of wax. He would then toss this ball on a fire, causing a dramatic explosion, and, if you followed his story, the paper was sent to the devil, who would read it. When he would then later retrieve the paper for them, completely intact, the client's belief in the trick was cemented by their amazement. In reality, the whole charade was little more than a sleight of hand trick, wherein he substituted the original wax ball for a second filled with the flammable powder. He pocketed the first and exploded the second, leaving him free to read the client's wishes before returning them. This trick had allowed him to amass a great deal of incredibly personal and potentially damning information from women across all walks of Paris society. Lesage had met Voisin shortly after his arrival in Paris in the 1660s, and in a short time the pair had become lovers, where Lesage quickly showed his inclination towards occult magic by burying a sheep's heart in the garden in a plot to kill her husband. During his early days in Paris, Lesage had partnered with a priest named Francois Mariette, and in 1668 both were arrested for what was officially noted as impieties. These impieties had actually involved saying prayers over the corpses of dead frogs whilst chanting scripture backwards in alleged black masses, in a multitude of ritual ceremonies. Lesage had been sentenced to the galleys, sailing as a slave on a ship in the Caribbean, but for reasons unexplained, very possibly to do with his connections to high-ranking and influential clients, he was freed after only a few years, which allowed him to return to Paris, where he immediately fell back into his old ways, practicing astrology, alchemy, and conducting ritual seances, which, to give him his credit, was a fairly unique set of skills at the time. He also sold love potions made from a hideous concoction of the target's urine, sheep's hearts, and pigeon's blood. This mixture would be placed into a vial, and then chants calling on Lucifer, Astaroth, and Beelzebub were carried out over the top of it. At the end of the ceremony, Lesage instructed his clients to bury the foul mixture in the basement of whoever it was they were trying to ensnare. During his questioning, Lesage actually attempted to argue that he knew that all of his so-called magic was actually nothing more than a scam. He only carried it out, he said, in order to stop his clients from doing anything truly dangerous, like purchasing poison. In this way, he argued, he was actually helping to save lives rather than do anything nefarious or illegal. It was a bold move, and the officials were almost definitely not buying into it, but they did, at least for now, decide to postpone his trial in order to extract as much information from him as possible, something which would prove to be fairly fruitful. The first name that he was happy to throw under the bus was of course that of Voisin, who he said had murdered, or at least assisted in murder, for several clients. Like others had hinted at, he also said that he had numerous clients who were members of the royal court, including Claude de Van de Houlier, a member of the Montespan household, and a former lover of the king with whom he had fathered at least one child. To this end, Lesage said Voisin had regularly visited members in the royal palace of Saint-Germain. Voisin had apparently had several dealings with the Montespan household, including with the Marquise de Montespan herself, and that Voisin had allegedly attempted to install a servant into the household in order to carry out what he tantalisingly called an affair undertaken for Montespan. Beginning to feel uncomfortable with the direction that this inquiry was going, Le Reni informed the king of the recent accusations. Himself unnerved by everything that was coming out, the king quickly began working to ensure that he could remove any details that he deemed fit from the public record. A move that would pay dividends, especially since Lesage was not finished yet. After implicating Montespan, he also threw out the name of the Marshal Duc de Luxembourg, who had already been implicated by Bossuet whilst under torture. Now Lesage was happy to furnish the inquiry with further details, saying that the general had partook in his own magic trick, and when he had later looked at the sheet of paper full of his wishes, it contained a list of several people that he wanted dead, all of which would have furthered his social and political career and have been dangerously close to treason. When Lesage's magic trick had obviously failed, he said the general turned to others instead, including Vigoureux and Bossuet, who both carried out rituals requesting the help of the devil that involved the use of animal hearts spiked with nails. Naturally, Lesage was not giving any of this information up for free. He was angling for a pardon, and he was happy to thrill Le Reni with these stories if he thought it might get him off the hook. For his part, Le Reni had been impressed, and he began to believe that the Chambre Ardente was quickly turning into something with potentially huge implications. Choosing to pit Lesage against Voisin in the hope of bleeding as much information out of the pair as possible, the two began a long series of testimonies that would get progressively darker, more obscene and more potentially damaging as the days ticked by. Before long, the Duchess de Vivonne, the Duchess de Bouillon and the Marquise de Cessac were all facing fresh accusations. Some of these accusations were more concerning than others. At first, Cessac simply wanted the devil to help him win at cards, whilst he gambled with the king. But later, he returned to Lesage for a magic ritual involving sewing a human bone stolen from the cemetery into his brother's shirt, which was supposed to rush him to his death, a fate that Cessac hoped would allow him the space to marry his brother's wife. In the case of Bouillon, she had allegedly offered Lesage a large sum of money to kill her husband. By Christmas of 1679, the Chambre Ardente had been running for almost a year. The king, who had kept abreast of the whole affair, was fairly convinced that the issues Le Reni was uncovering had riddled the royal court, striking deep into the depths of those that surrounded him. His fears were realised early in 1680 when arrest warrants were issued for several members of the court, including those of the Comtesse de Soissons, the Vicomtesse de Polignac, the Marquis de Cessac and the Marechal Duc de Luxembourg. Despite the king's hopes and efforts to keep such arrests quiet, rumours of the pending arrests soon found their way to the streets of Paris, causing an almighty stir and bringing the Chambre Ardente to the forefront of almost everyone in the country. Perhaps unsurprisingly, thanks to their rank, almost all of the four managed to evade arrest. The king himself fed information to Soissons' guards, allowing her time to alight from Paris at 4 a.m. in the morning, complete with a good amount of gold and jewels. This did little for her in the eyes of the public, who, aside from finding the obvious favourable treatment distasteful, circulated rumours that she had to have been guilty of some pretty awful crimes if she was so desperate to flee from justice. Following her midnight dash, she was never able to return to Paris for the rest of her life, and she died, more or less in exile, 28 years later. Polignac also fled Paris after friends gave her a tip-off that her arrest warrant had been issued. She returned to Paris, but only after the king had died in 1715. Cessac fled to England, eventually returning to Paris 12 years later, where he joined the military and was eventually pardoned. The Marechal Duc de Luxembourg, however, felt he had no reason to run, despite the accusations that he had sought out magical means to murder his wife. Confident of his acquittal, he gave himself up to the authorities voluntarily, a move that he perhaps later regretted when he was left to sit in a small, dirty cell situated next to the banks of a lake full of the city's detritus. Whilst he awaited questioning, rumours flew through the streets. Some believed that he had sold his soul to the devil in order to become impervious to bullets and cannon fire, whilst others thought that he had traded for a ring that had made him invisible. The most lurid rumours pictured him having orgies with dozens of women and priests and making sacrifices to the devil. In truth, the officials were struggling to mount a solid case against him at all, and they eventually settled on having him sign a written account of his testimony, which they later doctored, adding several new lines to the document. When Luxembourg became aware of this deception, he demanded a handwriting expert examine the document, though Lerigny denied this request. It was also proven difficult to secure a positive identification of him by any of the fortune tellers, priests and magicians who were supposedly involved in his accusations. When his trial finally went ahead, he was fully acquitted, much to the displeasure of the king, who ordered him banished from Paris, though something must have given him a change of heart, as a year later he re-summoned him and reinstated him as captain of the guard. Meanwhile, the king was becoming increasingly aware of the damage that the inquiry was doing to his court in the eyes of the public. The treatment of Luxembourg had come dangerously close to humiliating and discrediting the entire inquiry. This wasn't helped by the fact that many of the arrests made had been so far-reaching that people were being dragged in for questioning on some fairly spurious accusations made for little reason other than to push back the trial date for the original accuser, whilst many more arrests were made against people who may have seen someone who knew someone who might have seen Lessage's wax ball trick. Rather than attempt to roll the whole thing back, however, the king chose to double down, broadening the remit and officially making witchcraft, sacrilege, impurities and profanations through words and invocations an official part of the Chambre Ardente. By February of 1680, time had finally run out for Voisin. Her trial was held on the 17th of February, and unsurprisingly, she was found guilty and sentenced to torture and execution. For 3 days before her execution, she was tortured, but throughout she never gave any more information to the officials. Lerigny later claimed, in annoyed tones, that he believed the torturers had gone light on her, but it seems unlikely. When the torture was finally over, she was carted through the streets of Paris to the Place de Grève, where she was chained to a stake and burnt alive. As execution after execution were carried out, the Chambre Ardente geared up for one of the most prominent players yet, as Lerigny continued to investigate what was, by now, a vast sprawl of accusations and allegations. Several months earlier, Lesage had implicated the Duchess de Vivonne in the affair by accusing her of making a pact with the devil, whom she hoped would grant her wishes, and through these accusations, Lerigny had gradually found himself investigating a woman named Françoise Philastre. Philastre had been arrested several months earlier, in December, after she had applied for a position in the household of Marie-Angélique de Sorel, or the Duchess of Fontaine, who just so happened to be a young woman who had recently become the mistress of the king. Accusations against Philastre now flew, and before long she was being placed at the scene of a series of black mass ceremonies where she had reportedly been surrounded in candles while she gave birth to a child that was heavily rumoured to have been sacrificed to the devil, though some also said that one member of the ritual had removed the baby to a hospital after she had feared for its safety. It was also claimed, like so many others, that she had visited several fortune tellers and magicians hoping to purchase poisons, and had participated in ceremonies both to aid in love affairs and to bring about the death of others. The big fallout from these accusations, however, were the people that Philastre was associated with. Once more, Montespan's name came to the fore, and it quickly became knowledge around the inquiry that the king's now former mistress had long been a client of a priest named Etienne Guibourg, who had allegedly carried out a series of black masses, using the stomach of the naked bodies of women as an altar, including Montespan herself. The priest was also alleged to have carried out dozens of sacrifices, murdering newborn children as gifts to the devil, and on one occasion slitting the throat of a child and pouring the blood into a chalice that was then used in a black mass performed over Montespan's naked body. Now, if these allegations weren't shocking enough, Montespan was further implicated when she was accused of purchasing hundreds of love potions, spells and ceremonial aids, all targeting the king in the hopes of winning back his favour. When this was appearing to fail, she instead apparently turned to murder, both targeting the king's new mistress, the Duchess of Fontaine, and the king himself. All of this testimony was backed up by Marie Marguerite Montfaucon, the daughter of the now long since executed Voisin, who said that she had helped assist her mother in a plot to present the king with a poisoned document for which her mother had been paid a huge sum of money by Montespan herself. If anything in the inquiry had been sensational before, these accusations were nothing short of a ballistic explosion. Despite some of the stories being patently absurd, Le Reni was forced to accept them all as perfectly true, and he dug deep into the investigation by questioning all of those involved in hopes he could get to the truth of the matter. None of his efforts were helped by situations like the trial of Philastra, which saw her found guilty and sentenced to torture and execution. During her torture, she told the officials that she had supplied Montespan with love powders intended for the king and poison intended for Fontaine, though before she was executed by being burnt alive, she retracted all of her accusations, saying that she did not want to go to her death with lies on her conscience and that she had only made them in the first place in order to give her torturers the information that they wanted. At the same time he was dealing with this complicated investigation, Le Reni was being harangued by the king, who was requesting that his investigations be kept secret and ordering him to keep all accusations of Montespan out of the public record. This placed Le Reni in a difficult position. If he put people on trial, then the accusations against Montespan would be entered into the public record. If, on the other hand, he overlooked the accusations, he would potentially be letting go dozens and dozens of criminals who had carried out some of the darkest crimes of the whole inquiry. For now, he chose to buy himself some time, suspending the Chambre Ardente whilst he investigated the accusations further. Unfortunately for all involved, the more Le Reni dug, the more he came to believe that the accusations had merit. He uncovered another priest who made similar, if somewhat more reserved, accusations against Montespan, all of which seemed to dovetail with the allegations already made against her. After weeks and weeks of digging, however, Le Reni found himself still unable to make a firm conclusion, and he was eventually only saved by the king, who, stepping in, handed the investigation over to two men, Letellier, the Chancellor, and Colbert, the General of Finance, who he hoped would bring some form of conclusion. Whilst this might have seemed a way to hand the investigation off to an impartial judge, it should probably be noted that both Vivonne and Montespan were related to Colbert's daughter by marriage, and that Colbert had long been a critic of the Chambre Ardente, feeling that it brought nothing but ridicule to the French nation. In the end, he concluded that there were three options open to them. Either they could dissolve the inquiry entirely, at the danger of enraging the public for not giving them a conclusion, nor any closure, or they could forge ahead, trying everyone not related to the Montespan accusations, and trying those that accused her of slander. Or, thirdly, they could continue with the trials as before, but refrain from any more torture in the hopes that they would get more reliable testimony. A series of protracted meetings were carried out by the king, with the eventual outcome that they should finish the trials, omitting all of those that could incriminate Montespan, heavily redacting testimonies and transcripts in order to keep the information from reaching the public. It was, as expected, an outcome that infuriated Le Reni. In the end, the Chambre Ardente was dissolved by the king in July 1682, and all documents incriminating Montespan were kept in secret by the king's secretary, and eventually they were burnt 2 months after the death of Le Reni in 1709. The Marquise de Montespan continued to live in the royal court, perhaps entirely clueless to the accusations made against her, for more or less the rest of her life, though the king distanced himself from her, never taking her as his mistress again, and she faded from the court over several years, eventually dying in 1709. In total, the whole affair had seen 194 arrests, 36 executions, 23 exiles, and 55 prisoners who were kept in perpetual isolated confinement in fortresses around rural France. In one positive move, new laws were written making supplying poison for the intent of murder a criminal act, whilst alchemists and apothecaries were given tighter restrictions, requiring practitioners to have a permit and suppliers to keep records of their sales. In 1692, an edict passed seeing that any fortune tellers or magicians were to be banished as charlatanism and sacrilege. Whatever the truth of any of these accusations, it's probably fair to say that much of what transpired during what would become known as the Affair of the Poisons was little more than moral panic, driven by fear from all sides. It was a monumental scandal that had been fueled by lies, torture, pain and suffering, leading to one of Europe's largest criminal cases, which may have been little more than a witch hunt, and in many cases, it quite literally was. So that was the Affair of the Poisons, and there's a fair bit to talk about that after these short advert breaks. Welcome back. So yes, what a story. It's a really complicated story that, I'll be honest, is not at all conducive to good storytelling, I don't think. It's just, there's just hundreds of names, and many of them are really complicated. They're French. My French pronunciation is almost definitely terrible. But not only that, they're like, medieval French names, so they're really complicated. But if you want to read more, then I definitely would recommend reading some books about it, because obviously I've skimmed an awful lot for this episode. And I mean, when I say skimmed, I've presented you the story, right? But there is a lot of little avenues that this story goes down, obviously, as there would be, because there were so many arrests, right? So basically, I tried to keep the skeleton of the story there, if you like, with the facts, the core facts, and the general sort of feel for the full story. But yes, there are definitely a lot of books that you can read if you want to read more. If you're interested in the court, the books that I took away with me were really interesting, were the Duc de Loire, de Rouvroy, Saint-Simon. So basically Saint-Simon's memoirs, right? The title of them is in the sources in the show notes, but they're basically his memoirs of his time in the court. And although they are definitely biased because they're just one man's perspective, it's a really interesting read. It's quite a big read. So, you want to pick the bits that you want to read, but it's really interesting in the sense that it gives you a good idea of what the court was actually like. So that's really interesting. If you're interested in this story in particular, there is a couple of books. Again, they're in the show notes, and they're definitely worth reading, because so the story is much further sprawling than what I could fit into an hour. And to be honest, what I could reasonably expect anyone to want to listen to, because I read a couple of these books, and there were just so many names. Going back to what I was saying about it not being conducive to good storytelling, there's just so many names that it just becomes very complex very quickly. What's sort of more frustrating is I tried to keep them to one name, right? So each character had one name, but in reality, some of them had 2 or 3 different sort of names. And the books that are written about this frustratingly decide to just jump around and call them the different 3 names all the time. So not only is there just a monumental amount of characters, they've all got multiple names, and all of their names are complicated and French and, old-fashioned French. So yeah, it's really difficult, but definitely well worth a read if you wanted to, read more about it. So what do we think about it? I'm not sure about you. I personally think that a lot of this is not true. I think almost all of the inquiry was based on lies and nonsense. I think it's definitely true that it was a huge moral panic at first, and that's what started it. To sort of ask the core question, was the inquiry even necessary? I think probably not. Everyone's sort of concerned about this underground poison ring that almost definitely didn't seem to exist. There basically seemed to be a lot of people going to visit these magicians and fortune tellers and having weird spells done to try and kill their spouses or whatever, but actual dealing of poisons seemed to be quite minimal. Now, I think perhaps a more sort of measured way of doing it would have been to have investigated the fortune tellers, perhaps like some sort of underground sting. That I would have thought would be sort of the better way of doing it. Instead, they created this massive panic, created a huge inquiry, freaked out, and ended up arresting like hundreds of people. They then tortured a lot of them after keeping them in terrible conditions. the people had so many reasons to lie. You know, only one of them actually did come out and say, look, I said all that stuff just because I was trying to give you what I thought you wanted. But so much of it, I think, you know, they have so many reasons to lie. They were kept in poor conditions. Some of them were arrested for very little reason and then kept for weeks, if not months. They were, if found guilty, they were almost definitely executed. They're tortured beforehand. So, you know, a lot of people were trying to put off this trial. So they were desperately trying to make themselves valuable by giving all this information. And of course, that you can tell, like, as you read it, and there are some transcripts of some of the inquiry and some of the questioning, although it's quite hard to get because obviously not all of it's available anymore. But you can tell how the people being questioned escalate their stories over time, and you can see they're trying desperately to make or keep themselves relevant and keep themselves interesting enough to be kept alive, basically. And so, yeah, personally, I think a huge amount of this is just based on lies and nonsense. Essentially, it's impossible to say how much of it. I think, you know, it obviously, you know, I do think it had some merit. How much, though, it's just impossible to tell. And it's the same with the, you know, the poison epidemic itself. It's impossible to tell. You know, at the time, the science just wasn't there, and so we have no idea because, you know, medicine wasn't all that great either, and people did die unexpectedly and at younger ages. So looking back at it now, it's quite hard to say, oh, that person died when they're only, say, in their 30s. That's suspicious. It could be, but it could also just be that they had some kind of like disease or illness or sickness. So it's very, very hard to tell. Essentially, the whole poison epidemic seemed to be started from sort of fear, panic, and xenophobia, realistically. So yeah, how much of it was true? I don't know. I think a lot of it was lies and nonsense. I think Montespan is the interesting one. I think she possibly would have visited fortune tellers too, and I think there's every chance that she would have, you know, had spells made to bring her favour with the king. I don't think for a second that she was laying naked over an altar and having chalices full of baby's blood passed over her. You know, that were these newborn babies that were being sacrificed to the devil. I don't believe any of that. What I do believe is that she was possibly having sort of like incantations or you know, these spells that Lesage was saying were, you know, patently false, basically. I think perhaps she was doing that. I can imagine when you look at her life in the court, I think two reasons. I can imagine that she would have been desperate enough to give it a try. And secondly, going to these fortune tellers was quite a fashionable thing to do. You know, it was quite a trendy form of entertainment for a lot of people. And so I don't think it would have been out of the realm that she would have had contact with some of these fortune tellers. So I do sort of half believe the stuff with Montespan. I don't necessarily think I believe that she was going to poison anyone or that she was, you know, doing all these mad demonic things. I do think there's an element of truth. I think that's actually sums up all of it. I think there is an element of truth to all of it, but I think it was all blown out, completely out of proportion, made to be much more than it was. I don't know if that's what you think or if that's the idea that you came to listening to it. Let me know what you think if you want. You can get in touch with me, email contact@darkhistories.com. You can, all social media, I'm on, the website, darkhistories.com is sort of a hub. All the links are in the show notes and on my website. You'll also find links to everything there, including all the ways that you can support the show, which is always you know, gratefully received. I mentioned it once or twice before, probably, but I'm you know, I make this podcast by myself, so you know, that's good in that I don't have a huge amount of overheads, but it's also a financial obligation or responsibility that I have. So yeah, obviously any help is greatly received, but the show's always free, and you know, there are other ways that you can support, and it's all on the website. Go check it out if you want to. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. As always, I hope you enjoyed this episode. It's good to be back. Like I say, from now until Christmas, we're going to be back. Some people have already been sending me in their Christmas campfire submissions for this year, which is amazing. I haven't mentioned that yet, and I'll leave it for a bit. But yeah, that's good. So that's gearing up to be a fun time as always. But I'll be here from now until Christmas. So yeah, until next episode, 2 weeks time. Thanks very much for listening. I've been Ben. This has been Dark Histories. Take care. Sleep tight.